JavaScript Array method of map. When it was introduced, it came into a dark world where people considered for each to be our savior for iterating through datasets in JavaScript, but it was a false prophet. Originally, we had the for loop, the ancient, the original, and then we had the false prophet, the for each method, and finally we have the map method. For loop is the original iterator method for arrays and datasets in JavaScript, and is arguably the most performant out of the lot, but also the most verbose. For each was the first attempt at a much simpler syntax and essentially executes a provided function once for each array element, though it had a problem. It had an expensive iteration experience that contained a second check, one more than the ancient for loop method over each item in an array, but it was easier to write and work with, so it saw widespread adoption. But in our darkest hour came one of the most popular array methods to date that took the best of both previous methods and merged them into one with a new modern syntax, the map method. Map creates an array from calling a specific function on each item in the parent array. Map is a non-mutating method that creates a new array as opposed to mutating methods, which only makes changes to the calling array. That means it does not change the original array. It keeps it immutable, which means it doesn't change. If an array element does not have a value, it's smart enough to know that it doesn't execute the function over it either. This method can have many uses when working with arrays. In this tutorial, you'll look at 4 noteworthy uses of map in JavaScript: calling a function of array elements, converting strings to arrays, rendering lists in JavaScript libraries, and reformatting array objects. Now, if we look at the browser support, map has fantastic support across the board and is even supported by Internet Explorer 11. It's very safe to use natively. Right, let's move to step 1, calling a function on each item of an array. So map accepts a callback function as one of its arguments, and an important parameter of that function is the current value of the item being processed by the function. This is a required parameter. With this parameter, you can modify each item in an array to create a new function. Let's show an example of that. So we'll have an array, we'll call it number array, and we'll just add some random numbers, and then what we'll do is we will have our function here which will iterate over each element in the array. So we'll call it numbers, and we will then map over everything, and we'll say number is what we'll have each element called, and then what we'll do is we will return the number, but we will times it by 3. So then if we go down here and then if we console log that, so we can see the result of our function going over each element in the array, we should, if we use node, see what that says. So the file is called arraymap.js. We'll use node to execute it in the terminal, and there you go. It's taken each element in the array, executed this function by using the map method. So it's put the array here and it's mapped over it, and it said each element is going to be called number within the scope of this function, and what I want to do is I want to return the number and times each value by 3, and then we're just simply console logging the function that's going over it because it's returning this, and each time it runs over this array it is returning the returned value of number arrays elements times 3. And that simply is the most basic version of map using the full JavaScript syntax, but we can simplify it and do it better. So the way we simplify it is if we delete all of this, and what we'll do is we'll go down here and we'll make a new function called make number, and we are going to be using a fat arrow syntax, shorthand for a function, and we will basically call it 3. So what we've done there is we have created the functionality and separated the logic from the map method. So what we're saying is this is what we want to have done on each and every element within the map method. And so what we'll do is we'll come down here and we will call the function and then use the map method. And there we go. So we have the array here, we're mapping over it, and what we're saying is we just want the function in here. And what this does, you could say, let's have this array, but we're going to map over it and we're going to execute this function. But what if we want to times the value by 2? Well, now we can do that, and we can do that as many times as we want. And we can have different functionality. We can have 3 here, 2, and 5. So then if we decide we want to execute it by 2, if we want to execute it by 5 or 3, you can do. You have huge reusability. You have a lot more room for maneuverability in how you write your map methods. And let's console log that out. So if we go to console log, and we'll say, we'll do the same as last time. We'll execute this one, and it should provide us the exact same results. And we'll use node in the terminal. And there you go, the exact same results, but now we can also do it for other array methods. And we'll change that to 5. And boom, there you go. And just writing it like this makes it a lot more readable. Now let's move on to step 2, converting a string to an array. Now map is known to belong to the array prototype. In this step, you'll use it to convert a string to an array. You are not developing the method to work for settings here, rather you will use a special call method. Everything in JavaScript is an object, and methods are functions attached to these objects. Now the call allows you to use the context of one object on another. Therefore, you would be copying the context of map in an array over to a string. Here's an example. So we have the name here of Harry. And what we're going to do is we're going to have the map method as an array prototype in this value. And we're going to call a function here using the map method. And we are going to return each letter of this method. And we're going to use the call function to copy the context over. So similar to our previous methods. So using this method, we're going to map over the name here. And let's see what that logs out. Pop that in there. And let's use node to console log that out. Boom, and there you go. You can see that it's taken each part of the name. So here you can see we use the context of map on a string and passed an argument of the function that map expects. Now this function is a lot like the split method for a string, only that each individual string character can be modified before returning it to an array. So we can see here that we've made a little mistake. Now this is adding an A at the end of every character. If we delete that, it should just return us each letter. There you go. And you know, if we want to add a number, we can do. So we'll add number 1. And there you go. So let's move on to step 3, rendering lists in JavaScript libraries. Now JavaScript libraries like React use map to render items in a list. This requires the JSS syntax. In this example, we can see the map method is wrapped in JSS syntax. Now this is a stateless component in React which renders a div with a list. The individual list items are rendered using map. Iterate over the name arrays initially created. This component is rendered using React DOM on the DOM element with an ID of root. So as we can see, there's many use cases for map. And in React, it is something that you will use quite a lot. So let's move on to step 4, reformatting array objects. Now, array objects are surprisingly common. So let's move on to step 4, reformatting array objects. Now, map can be used to iterate through objects in an array and in a similar fashion to traditional arrays, modify the content of each individual object and return a new array entirely. Now, this modification is done based on what is returned in the callback function. Here is an example. And you can see here that this is an array of objects. And it is a very surprisingly common data set to have. Now it can be quite complicated, but what you need to get your head around is that it's similar to the other methods. We have our array here and we're creating a new function to iterate over each element, and each element would be an object. So what you need to do is you need to be able to iterate over each object and get the data. Now, how do you do that? What we're going to do is we're going to use a system for going over objects and accessing that information. And there's two main methods. There's bracket notation and dot notation. Now, obviously we're not going to go into detail as to what bracket notation is and dot notation is completely, but all you need to know is accessing the object itself. Once you've mapped over it, you can use the bracket style, or you could use the dot notation style. And both of these essentially do the same thing, and you can access them and then do what you want with them. And you can have some kind of function, and we'll show that shortly. And we can see that we've modified each object in the array using the bracket and dot notation. Now this can be employed to process or condense received data before being saved or passed on a front-end application. Some really good uses of bracket and dot notation. So let's console log that out and see what we get. So we'll console log users by likes, and we'll see what the bracket and dot notation gives back to us. And here you go. And you can see that you've modified each object in the array using the bracket and dot notation, and it can be employed to process or condense received data before being saved or passed on a front-end application. So I would certainly look into bracket and dot notation if you do start to get into iterating over arrays of objects, which you undoubtedly will. So those were the 4 uses of the map method in JavaScript, and amongst having great browser support, retaining the original array stays immutable, the performance is negligible compared to the for loop. And it's one of the biggest reasons people still stick to the for loop and ignore for each entirely is performance reasons. And it's a reason why a lot of JavaScript libraries just use the for loop under the engine of their framework, is because it is very performant. However, map is arguably just as performant, but largely map and the for loop are very similar in performance gains, mostly because the for each is very expensive. Another added benefit is map works great with functional programming. It's a far better syntax to write in and actually loops through each item of the dataset in the correct order. With the way the web and JavaScript is moving, map should be the method you iterate over datasets with, and it's one that I highly recommend newbies to really learn and get their head around. So if you found this useful in your understanding of maps, leave a comment below. I've been Harry, like and subscribe, and as always, stay curious.